Good evening. Welcome to the West Wash Dam Rehabilitation Project Update Meeting. I'd like to start the meeting with introductions. My name is Steve Gamilis. I'm a project coordinator with Utility Services. Also at the City of Reno is John Simpson, engineering manager with Utility Services Department. Pass on the microphone to Natural Resources Conservation Service for their introduction.
Good evening, Mark Martini, NRCS, and I'm the watershed team lead.
Introduction from our engineering team, Dow.
My name is Alex Stodmeister as the hydraulic and hydrologic modeling lead.
Good evening, Keith Karpstein, senior engineer and project manager for Dow.
Hello, I'm Greg Lyman. I'm also a senior engineer with Dow.
Hi, I'm Emily Paris, and I'm the environmental specialist.
Good evening, everyone. Is that working? Yeah. Like I said, my name is Alex Stodmeister. I was the hydraulic and hydrologic modeling lead on this project, and Greg voted me best looking in the team, so I have to give the presentation tonight. But thank you everyone for coming. Please hold your questions until the end of the presentation, unless you are on Zoom, and then please, as we go along, put your questions into the chat there. And then are we sharing the presentation? Just one moment while we share the PowerPoint. Excellent. Okay, like Steve introduced, this is the public project update meeting for the East Wash and West Wash Dam Rehabilitation Project. The project stakeholders on this are the City of Reno as owner, USDA NRCS as the lead federal agency, and Dowell, whom I represent, as the project engineer. You should also note that the EPA Region 9 is a cooperating agency on this project. So project background. As you can see on the map here, we are showing the East and West Wash Dam project area. The West Wash Dam is on the southern end, highlighted in green, and the East Wash Dam is to the north, highlighted in purple. The West Wash Dam was constructed in 1960 and the East Wash Dam in 1961. They were both constructed under the Watershed Protection and Flood Prevention Act. Both dams create a linked stormwater control system for the city. The original watershed plan evaluated a life of 50 years. That watershed plan was written in 1958. So these dams have exceeded their evaluated lifespan. Because they have exceeded their evaluated lifespan of 50 years, they are eligible for rehabilitation through the NRCS Watershed and Flood Prevention Operations Program. Both of these dams, due to their age and their proximity to residents, are classified as high hazard. The Nevada Division of Water Resources, or NDWR, defines a high hazard dam as a dam that has reasonable potential for loss of life and or extreme economic loss. Additionally, the West Wash Dam currently does not meet dam safety requirements. As such, the city and USDA NRCS have gone into an agreement to rehabilitate this dam. Past studies have also indicated that the West Wash Dam has hydraulic and hydrologic inadequacies as well. So, project timeline and schedule, where are we at? So this is our project timeline to date. It starts in October 2020 when Dowell, formerly Far West Engineering, signed on as the project engineer with the City of Reno. Throughout 2021, we had several deliverables, including a public participation plan, a data collection analysis report, and then our first hydrologic, hydraulic, and sedimentation analysis. In October of 2021, we had a public meeting to discuss the project scope and project alternative scopes and received comment from the public at that time. Into 2022, we've issued the second part of the HH&S, as well as our preliminary alternatives analysis. In October of 2022, we issued our final alternatives analysis. And that brings us to today, January of 2023. which is the project update public meeting. With this project is supposed to conform with the NWPM, or the National Watershed Program Manual. And part of that is it includes a purpose and need statement. So the purpose of this project, number one, is to preserve the flood protection function of both the East and West Wash dams. Number two, to protect lives and property in the surrounding urban area. And number three, comply with current performance and safety standards in a cost-effective and environmentally acceptable manner. On to the need part of our statement. The first need is we need to address the current deficiencies of the West and East Wash dams. We need to bring them into compliance with all dam safety regulations, engineering standards, and performance criteria. The second is to ensure that the watershed structure is properly maintained to minimize the risk to lives and property, both in the immediate area and downstream of the dam. It should be noted at this time that the West Wash and East Wash work together as an integrated system, and so they were analyzed and evaluated as such. Some of the project challenges we face. First off is dam deficiencies. As stated before, there are repairs and maintenance that have been identified in past inspection reports, as well as in hydraulic analyses. Repairs and maintenance are defined into three categories: immediate, short-term, and long-term actions. For the East and West Wash dams, there were items that fell into all three, but these range from items such as clearing brush away from a manhole access to updating emergency action plans and monitoring possible erosion and spillways. As previously stated, these dams do have some hydraulic deficiencies. The main deficiency right now for the West Wash Dam is that it will overtop during what's called a probable maximum precipitation event. Later on in the presentation, I'm going to kind of define that a little bit better, but a probable maximum precipitation event, or PMP, is essentially a worst case scenario storm. It's the largest amount of rain we could ever receive in this area under a certain duration of time. Additional hydraulic deficiencies for the East Wash Dam include undercutting of the auxiliary spillway or breaching of the auxiliary spillway if it overtops at a certain level. And these hydraulic deficiencies were also identified in previous reports. The last dam deficiency is that sediment accumulation has reduced runoff volume over the past 60 years. Now, some of our project challenges also include city growth and increased urbanization. As you can imagine, when these dams were built in 1960 and 1961, there were very, very little residents, properties, and development around them. Since then, Reno has grown steadily. Since 1960, Reno has grown at an average rate of 3% per year to today. With the original watershed plan written in 1958, we weren't considering that we were going to build all of Peavine. Also, urban land use changes to the project area have made it difficult hydraulically for these dams to function properly. And the city of Reno will continue to grow. Per the city of Reno master plan, our population today is 180,000, and it is expected to be 301,000 by 2036. Right now, today, the dam is estimated to provide protection against flooding for approximately 30,000 of Reno's citizens. Our project opportunities. The first project opportunity is to maintain downstream flood protection. We want to continue to use these dams in the way that they were designed, which is to protect property and life from flooding. The second is to reduce possibility of dam failure. When an earthen dam or a dam made of earth and dirt, like the East or West Wash, overtops, it runs a very high risk of breaching. Because right now, the dam will overtop during a PMP, it is at a high risk for failure in that worst absolute case scenario. So we want to reduce that possibility. Thirdly, we want to comply with all NDWR and NRCS dam safety criteria. It should be also noted that this project is complying with NEPA, or the National Environmental Policy Act, and the National Historic Preservation Act, Section 106. NRCS has determined that both these dams are historic properties. However, the West Wash only the West Wash is considered to have adverse effects in a historical context. NRCS is currently working with SHPO, or the State Historic Preservation Office, on different mitigation strategies for this. Proposed measures for this mitigation include SHPO-approved historical signage, also historical documentation, plans and pictures of the historic dam. It should be noted that these proposed mitigation measures include but are not limited to just the two listed here. We could have more or less as the project moves forward. All right, so now I want to talk about the different project alternatives that were analyzed as a part of our planning process. I want to start real quick by defining some key terms that you will hear throughout this presentation to help us all understand and work on the same footing. The first thing I want to talk about real quick is storm recurrence. Here in Reno, we've heard a lot of stories and a lot of different storm occurrences. People talk about 25-year storms, 50-year storms, 100-year storms. What that means is, for example, a 100-year storm means that there's a 1% chance of that storm occurring within any given year. So statistically, if you stretch out 100 years, that storm should occur once. Likewise, a 200-year storm has a 0.5% chance of happening within any given year. So again, we stretch out 200 years, statistically that storm should happen once. Some examples to kind of put our minds in the right headspace over what storms in our area look like. The 1997 was considered a 50-year storm / flood based off the Truckee River flows. The more recent 2017 flooding is approximately a 25-year storm based on the rainfall and duration that occurred at the airport. The other storm occurrence that you're going to hear about is that I've touched on briefly already is the probable maximum precipitation event. The science definition of this is the maximum precipitation meteorologically possible for a given area. So that is the worst case scenario. And it should be noted that this is a location specific value. The PMP here in Reno is very different from the PMP in Las Vegas. It's very different from the PMP in Florida. We use documents prepared by the National Weather Service to help us calculate the PMP for our specific area. I would like to talk about some dam terms now. First is the principal or primary spillway. The principal or primary spillway is the primary path that stormwater will take exiting the dam. The second is the auxiliary or emergency spillway. The auxiliary or emergency spillway acts as a safety valve for a dam. As the water level of a dam increases, it puts pressure on the dam. And to prevent the dam from overtopping, an auxiliary or emergency spillway is built so that water can escape and go quickly away from the dam to prevent it from breaching. The most recent example in memory is the Lake Orville Dam on the Feather River in 2017. Its emergency spillway activated and it prevented the dam from toppling. So what does that look like here in our two little stormwater dams? I don't know if individuals on Zoom can see the mouse, but here on the left side of the screen is the East Wash Dam. The East Wash Dam is unique in that it is a diversion dam as well as just being a normal stormwater retention dam. As such, it has two principal spillways. The first is a manhole inlet right here. This manhole inlet will drain the primary stormwater pond, and it's connected directly to the stormwater drainage system of the city of Reno. The second to the right is principal spillway number 2, is the large concrete channel that we all know and have seen at the East Wash Dam. This concrete channel's purpose is to divert excess stormwater from East Wash to the West Wash impoundment area. The auxiliary spillway of the East Wash Dam is actually the berm on the west side of what we're calling the bathtub that holds the diversion channel. This berm will overtop at a specified level and allow water to escape into the West Wash impoundment area. The West Wash Dam has a single principal spillway, and its inlet is a concrete structure at the toe of the dam. This concrete structure is the main principal exit of the stormwater. It then discharges, I don't know if you're seeing what I'm seeing. It discharges into a drainage ditch on the other side of the dam, which then flows for a little bit and then ends at a storm drain inlet that is again connected to the city of Reno storm drain infrastructure. The auxiliary spillway of the West Wash Dam is interesting. It's this path and channel just to the east of the dam. In fact, when I first went out on site, I thought that it was I thought that it was a trailhead, to be perfectly honest. But this is actually the auxiliary spillway. This is the emergency spillway. If water is too high in this dam, it will activate the spillway and release pressure off the dam. All right, so that's enough hydraulics and hydrology terms. I want to talk a little bit about some economic terms because the analysis was not just non-economics, it was economics as well. For the economics, we performed a benefit cost analysis. The benefit cost analysis produced benefit cost ratios for each one of the project alternatives. If a benefit cost ratio, or BCR, is greater than 1, that means it has a positive net present value. In other words, it's going to generate more economic benefits than economic costs. If a BCR is between 0 and 1, it generates economic benefits, but the project cost outweighs those benefits. However, because we are dealing with stormwater retention dams and human life, our goal is to minimize threat to human life. So if a BCR is between 0 and 1, it is still considered a positive outcome. A BCR that is less than 0 or negative, that alternative will generate greater economic disbenefits than benefits. That's just not great for what we're trying to do here. So real quick on how we got to our project alternatives. We started off with a list of 13 preliminary alternatives. These preliminary alternatives were a combination of design ideas, as well as certain alternatives that were required for us to do as part of the NRCS and National Watershed Program manual program. We then took these 13 project alternatives and we sat down with the project stakeholders, with the City of Reno and NRCS. We workshopped those alternatives and discussed them. Each alternative needed to meet the purpose and need of the project, and it also needed to meet the goals and policies of NRCS. If the preliminary alternative did not meet those two things, it was eliminated from consideration. We eliminated 8 of the preliminary alternatives based on this fact, and we selected 5 alternatives for a more detailed, thorough analysis. So the final project alternatives that we selected. Number 1, we selected a future without a project, the do nothing alternative. The second was to improve flood measures downstream of the dam. The third was to remediate the East Wash Auxiliary Spillway and the West Wash Dam, or rehabilitate them. The fourth option was to simply remove the dams and remove the dam safety criteria that were under for this area. The fifth alternative was to remove the dams and create a downstream flood channel to convey 100-year storm flows per the City of Reno regulations. I would like to note that after the alternative analysis, and as we go through this, please keep in mind that we came to the conclusion that alternative 3 is our preferred project alternative. So when you see some of these things that will look a little scary, frankly, please know and understand that alternative 3, rehabilitating the dams, is our preferred project. So how did we come to that realization? We performed both a non-economic and economic analysis. For the non-economic analysis, we had 6 different criteria that we based each alternative against. Each criteria had multiple sub-criteria and metrics that tied to those criteria. Those metrics and sub-criteria and criteria were weighted. They were given a score of 10 if we felt like they were the most important, or all the way down to 2.5 if we felt like they were the least important. Project stakeholders then met and ranked each alternative within these metrics. So if an alternative was given a score of 5, it was considered the best alternative for that metric. Likewise, it was given a metric of 1, or a score of 1 if it was the worst for that metric. We then multiplied those scores by the weighting we gave them, and we got a final score for each project alternative. The highest scoring alternative is considered the best from a non-economic perspective. So likewise, we performed an economic analysis. The first thing we did was create capital cost estimates. These capital cost estimates are for the construction and design of the project, and these were performed and created by Dowell. We also performed the benefit cost analysis that I mentioned earlier. This was performed by Hansford Economic Consulting, who were a sub-consultant to Dowell. All right, so let's jump into these alternatives. So the first one, the future without a project, the do nothing alternative. What this means is the dams are left as is. We will have no capital improvement projects to rehabilitate or remove or do anything. And what this means from a flooding perspective, as mentioned earlier, the East Wash Auxiliary Spillway, it will overtop during the 100-year storm event. When it activates at the 100-year storm event, the auxiliary spillway will undercut and fail per our models. The West Wash Auxiliary Spillway, it will activate during the 200-year storm event. The West Wash Dam will also overtop during the PMP and will then be at high risk of breach during that overtop. So some key points from the non-economic analysis for this alternative. The first, operations and maintenance. There would be no change to our existing O&M. Obviously, we're not doing anything, so it's not going to change what the city of Reno is doing. In terms of engineering, there's no project to design. However, the dam will still not meet the regulatory compliance that it needs to meet. Public and regional impacts of this project. There is no expected immediate impact. If we don't do anything, it's not going to affect you tomorrow. The next is environmental impacts with no change to the existing dams. There's no change to the existing environmental impact in the area. Likewise with right-of-way, there would be no change to the right-of-way for the project. And in terms of the level of flood protection, flooding occurs at the 200-year event when the West Wash Auxiliary Spillway is activated, and also during the PMP when it overtops the West Wash Dam. No changes there. Now this map is a little scary. And I've been told to couch my language on this one. But what this is this is a flooding inundation map. This shows what would happen in terms of flooding if the West Wash Dam were to breach during a PMP. You can see on the legend in the bottom left-hand corner, water depth will reach up to 40 feet in some areas. This is a vast part of Northwest Reno and into downtown Reno. I want to be very, very clear and state that this is considered a worst case scenario. This is like Noah build the ark, worst case scenario. Also, the city has emergency action plans in place for if this were to happen. They know, based on our models, they know whom to contact in terms of emergency services, residents, homeowners, whomever, to evacuate to minimize the risk to human life. All right, so let's talk about the economics real quick on alternative one. There's no cost. With no project comes no cost, and with no cost comes no benefit. So there is no BCR that's generated from this project. Alternative two. Alternative two is downstream flood improvements. What this does is this takes the no action alternative and leaves both dams in place and makes changes to the downstream flood infrastructure to protect against this PMP dam breach. The purpose of this alternative is to clear the flood path to minimize the risk to human health and life. What that means is, based on the inundation map I showed previously, any property that's expected to have 1 foot or greater of flooding would be purchased, any structures on that property demolished, and we would return the land to its original habitat. That accounts for about 664 properties. Properties with less than 1 foot or greater of expected flooding would simply be repaired if flooding damage occurred. So let's go through some non-economics on this one. This would have a huge increase to the city in terms of operations and maintenance and keeping the newly rehabilitated floodplain clear. From an engineering perspective, this has huge constructability and design constraints. Also, as you can imagine, large impacts to the downstream areas of the public. Environmentally, this project would have significant environmental disturbances to the urban landscape and to the existing dam sites. And we would need to purchase and demolish 664 properties and extend the right-of-way into those properties. The level of flood protection, the PMP would still overtop the West Wash Dam. However, flood damage would be minimal to the remaining properties and downstream of the dam. From an economic standpoint, it would cost $2.0 billion to do this project. That cost estimate includes not just engineering and construction, but property acquisition as well. It generates 0 economic benefits, and so it has a BCR of 0. The third project alternative, or the preferred project alternative, is to remediate the East Wash Auxiliary Spillway and West Wash Dam. As stated previously, the East Wash Auxiliary will fail during a larger storm event, like a 100-year or greater storm. What we would do is we would regrade that west berm of the East Wash and return it to its original design elevation, as well as armor the berm and the spillway itself with riprap and rock. The West Wash Dam would require several improvements. The first would be to regrade the impoundment area to increase the volume of stormwater, increase the storage volume for the stormwater, excuse me. We would also need to raise the height of the dam by 5 feet and lower the auxiliary spillway crest by 2.5 feet. Lowering the auxiliary spillway crest does sound a lot scarier, and I understand that, but the math shows that with the increase in impoundment volume, the auxiliary spillway will no longer activate at the 200-year storm event, but now the 500-year storm event. So we'd be increasing the flood protection. In addition, the auxiliary spillway, we would return it to its original design width of 80 feet and then armor the spillway with riprap and rock. Additionally, due to freeboard, which is essentially the space between our highest water elevation and the top of the dam, we have a freeboard requirement of 3 feet. In order to accomplish that around the dam, we would need to build a 2-foot parapet wall on the east corner of the West Wash Dam, and that wall would amount to about 75 feet. However, that wall could change during final design, or if we get a waiver on that requirement from regulatory authorities. So the non-economic points of this would actually reduce our operations and maintenance needs, as we would have better functioning dams and spillways as a result of it. From an engineering perspective, there are a few design constraints. However, the main thing is that it would bring the West Wash and East Wash dams into compliance. This would have minimal public and regional impacts to surrounding residents, really the only impacts coming during construction. From an environmental standpoint, this actually had the smallest environmental impact aside from alternative 1, which was the do nothing. We may need to see a slight change to the existing right-of-way depending on that parapet wall, but again, that is not finalized, and that would come out. That decision will be made during final design. The level of flood protection, we would increase our level of flood protection, and now flooding would only occur at the 500-year event, and the PMP would not overtop the West Wash Dam. So another scary map, but this shows kind of the improvements that we would see during a PMP. So this map shows what would the kind of flows we'd expect from the auxiliary spillway of the West Wash Dam during the PMP, or the probable maximum precipitation event. You can see our water depth now in the legend has gone from 40 feet to 25 feet, and we've lessened the amount of damage through the area. But again, this would be taken into consideration for the emergency action plan, and that emergency action plan would be updated based on final project design and modeling. The economics of this alternative is that it would cost $23 million, and it has a BCR of 0.16 to 1. So we would have some economic benefits. They would not outweigh the costs. However, as previously mentioned, because we do generate benefits, it is considered a positive in this regard. The fourth alternative is to remove both dams. We would remove both the dams as well as the principal and auxiliary spillways, and we would return the land and the area to pre-development conditions. This provides no flood protection to downstream residents. However, it allows the city of Reno and NRCS to remove dam regulations. Because there's no dam, we don't have to follow dam regulations or safety rules. So whereas before we're worried about a dam overtopping during the PMP, now we simply have to make sure that stormwater runoff from a 100-year event is contained, and the 100-year storm, a much lesser storm, becomes our design constraint. So the non-economics of this would increase our downstream O&M needs because we're allowing a lot more stormwater to pass through. So we'd see more damage to existing stormwater infrastructure. This project would not meet regulatory compliance for that 100-year storm. We would see flooding from that 100-year event, and we wouldn't be able to convey those flows downstream. This would actually have large impacts to downstream residents because of that flooding. From an environmental standpoint, there are multiple environmental impacts to disturbing that area in and around the dam. We would have to have no change to the existing right-of-way, though. All work would take place within existing city right-of-ways. And there would be no flood protection for downstream residents with this. This map shows what that inundation would look like, what that flooding would look like downstream of the dam from just a simple 100-year storm. As you can see, we'd have water reach depths of 20 feet, and we'd have large areas impacted from allowing the water to flow through the city. From an economic standpoint, this is really cheap, comparatively, at 5.5 million. However, the benefit cost ratio showed that it was a negative 96.3 to 1. So this only generated economic disbenefits. Last alternative is removing the dams, but now creating downstream improvements to convey that 100-year flow. What this would include is, again, removing the dams, the spillways, returning the area to pre-development conditions. Our design constraint is now the 100-year storm. And so we would build 3 channels that would convey the 100-year storm flows from the site all the way to the Truckee River. This would be 3.18 miles of stormwater trapezoidal channel. The city would be required to purchase and demolish 161 properties in order to create this channel. There would be 22 road culvert crossings, 1 railroad culvert crossing, and 1 culvert crossing under I-80. From an economic standpoint, this has huge increases in downstream O&M needs because city staff would have to monitor over 3 miles of stormwater channel. This has massive design and constructability constraints, mostly due to culvert crossings, purchasing properties, and trying to make that work. Obviously, this has large impacts to downstream residents. From the environmental standpoint, again, multiple environmental impacts due to removing the dams as well as changing the urban landscape downstream. As stated, the city would need to purchase and demolish 161 properties for the new right-of-way. And the level of flood protection would simply be the 100-year event contained. From an economic standpoint, this project would cost approximately $172 million, but generates 0 economic benefits, so has a BCR of 0. So when we compare our 5 alternatives, let's first look at our non-economics and compare. Like I stated before, we scored each alternative against the criteria, and this was our final scoring. Alternative 3 showed the highest score in our non-economic comparison. And then looking at our economic comparison, while alternative 3 is not the cheapest option, it does, however, have the only positive BCR out of the 5 alternatives selected. So what that means is that alternative 3, remediate the East Wash Auxiliary Spillway and the West Wash Dam, is our preferred project alternative. This project will reduce our required operations and maintenance. It will minimize impacts to surrounding residents. It increases the flood protection to downstream residents and will bring the West Wash Dam into compliance. Now that we have our preferred project alternative, what happens now? So through the rest of 2023, we'll have a few more deliverables and public meetings, but design will hopefully occur in 2024 with an eye for construction to begin in 2025 with an estimated time frame of approximately 3 years. So we're looking at project complete at about 2028, best case scenario, what we're looking at right now. Those immediate future milestones this year, this July, we will be issuing a draft of the environmental assessment and finding of no significant impact. In August, we will be having a public meeting for the public to comment on that environmental assessment and FONSI draft. And then we will issue the final environmental assessment and FONSI with all comments addressed in October of 2023. So with that, very long presentation, I apologize. Are there any questions? I'm going to turn around to the audience. Any questions from the audience or any questions from the Zoom meeting? I'm going to sit down and Steve's got the mic.
Questions from the Zoom meeting? Where does the West Wash Principle number 1 inlet go to?
So the West Wash Principle inlet, it drains into a 24-inch pipe that runs under the dam, and then it dumps all the stormwater into a ditch. That ditch flows down a couple hundred feet, and then there is a storm drain inlet that receives that water, and that inlet is tied directly to the City of Reno storm drain system. And so then it starts going through the network of ditches, pipes, and everything all the way down to the Truckee River. Oh, the next question, where would flooding occur if the East Wash Dam were to breach? How many and where are the affected homes? So actually, let me pull up that map if I can. Anyway, so if the East Wash Dam were to breach, that flooding would occur to the east of the inundation that we've seen, but it would actually join up in that same inundation area very quickly. As far as the number of homes, I don't have that off the top of my head, but I have that analysis and we can share it at another time.
Will that be included in the EA, the published EA?
Don't know if that specific inundation map is published in the EA, but it is published in the HHNS documents, which will be in the final document that comes out in October. The next one is dam can overtop during the PMF, though it needs to, the dam and reservoir are able to accommodate the inflow design flood for the tributary watershed without the failure of the dam or any other intended release of water. All of Clark County's regional flood control districts detention basins are designed to retain the 100-year event and pass the PMF through the auxiliary spillway. So essentially what he's saying is a dam should pass the PMF or the PMP through the auxiliary spillway, but then fully retain and not release any water for the 100-year event. Both of these dams are able to, well, excuse me, the West Wash can fully retain the 100-year storm. The East Wash does allow water to go over the auxiliary spillway in the 100-year storm, but because they're a linked system, that 100-year storm flow simply just goes into the West Wash impoundment area. So there is no flooding. So East Wash does have that issue with the law. And of course, the West Wash will overtop, which isn't great. Yeah, to be clear, West Wash in the 100-year, everything sits, the auxiliary spillway doesn't activate, everything sits within the West Wash impoundment area and only overtops in a PMP, which again is worst case scenario. The inundation maps only show Keystone Creek flows, but Keystone Creek joins Peavine Creek at Vine above the freeway in 1956. Both creeks flooded during a summer event. Why do we ignore the other two dams in this watershed that were built at the same time for the same purpose by the same people? So the history of that is interesting. In 2006, MacTech performed a study, and that was the first study that highlighted that West Wash Dam had hydraulic issues. It showed that the Peavine Dam had no issues at that time. Our study confirmed those findings for the West Wash and the East Wash. So what we were looking at is specifically the issues with the dam itself, not so much the flooding downstream. We were concerned about the dam overtopping and fixing that issue before we're solving additional stormwater flow problems that occurred downstream of the dam. That's kind of the scope of the project. If we were to do a study on all City of Reno stormwater infrastructure, we'd be looking at additional and adjacent stormwater basins and how those storm flows affect the city's infrastructure.
Circle back to the fact that the dams on the other creek have been studied and they don't have issues. West Wash has the issue. That's why we're here.
Does this require the necessity of eminent domain for any property owners? This does not. The preferred project alternative, we might have a slight change to existing right-of-way due to the parapet wall, but we don't know that at this time. It's expected based on preliminary analysis, not final design. My main concern is constant noise and dust. What are the plans for keeping this neighborhood from suffering for 3 years?
So when we estimated 3 years for this project, we felt that was a conservative estimate. We feel that this could probably be completed within a couple of seasons. As far as dust control, the contractor will use typical mitigation methods as far as watering of open areas to keep the dust down, potentially treating the surface of the soil with a dust palliative for long-term dust control. Construction noise, we would, typically construction would be limited to certain hours during the day. So you wouldn't have noise on weekends or evenings, but your typical 8 to 5, there would be construction noise. But typical equipment for construction would be fitted with, basically mufflers to buffer the noise as much as possible. But there will be some disturbances over the period of construction that simply can only be mitigated so far. Yes, and let me note that at the completion of the project, all disturbed areas will be permanently revegetated to reestablish the vegetation that's out there with a native seed mix.
2 questions from Karen Vargas. The first is, if the dam is raised 5 feet, will the existing homes to the east and west of West Wash Dam be in a flood zone? They will not. Even though we are raising that dam, yes, it increases the water surface elevation at certain levels, but because we are improving the impoundment volume area, there will be no change to the floodplain. The second is there were originally 13 alternatives considered for the project. Why were only 5 considered, and what were the other alternatives? I don't have the other 8 alternatives off the top of my head, but like I said, when we did the preliminary alternatives, we had to hit certain required ones like no action, downstream flood improvements. But then our engineering team, along with City of Reno and NRCS, looked at a wide variety of outside the box alternatives. I can tell you from my memory, one of them was actually to build an additional stormwater retention dam up the watershed in Keystone Canyon to help slow water down even further. That was obviously quickly eliminated due to federal land use problems, as well as the massive amounts of public and regional comments we'd receive. And also I mountain bike in that area just like everyone else. So we didn't want to do that. So we had a lot of these preliminary alternatives, but based on our criteria, our project purpose and need, and NRCS requirements, we pared it down to the 5.
Basically, when you eliminate a project that early, it's just because of it's unfeasible or infeasible. So feasible for financial engineering. I want to say about the 5 feet. There is this thing called freeboard where safety factor on most of that raise is affecting wet water there.
Said his prior comment was meant to convey that while the PMF is the design storm for these structures, the law doesn't say that the PMF must be retained. The dam must be able to accommodate the storm without failing, which could include passing the storm through the auxiliary spillway. With our proposed project alternatives, that's how we're approaching this. The PMF would go and pass through the auxiliary spillway. What we're doing is we're protecting the dam from overtopping and breaching in the event of the PMF. Frank said, I think the project alternative 3 sounds great. Thanks for explaining about Peavine Creek. Thanks, Frank. Jeannie asked, are there any dams upstream across the state line in California that represent concerns on their own, hence the haste to shore up the East Wash, West Wash dams? No, these dams are fed entirely by the Peavine Mountain watershed. So there are no dams in California that are affecting this. These are kind of the frontline dams coming into Reno off Peavine. LH asks, knowing what you know Knowing what you know, would you purchase a house in the flood zone? E.g., how concerned are you about 100-year, 500-year PMP flooding? That's a really good question. I live kind of close to this neighborhood. I live next to one of these dams. I actually live next to the Peavine Dam. So I understand why we'd be concerned about that. As far as PMP flooding, like I said, that is a worst case scenario. I frankly, I don't know if it will happen, but we have these things for a reason. Yeah, I don't know how to answer that.
Just like to add, I would not be concerned about the 100-year, even in its existing state. Shown over and over, it can pound the 100-year storm and works exactly as. And I don't know if this helps at all, but with the PMP, that's a storm that may never happen. It's used as a tool to make sure our designs never breach. Breaching is the thing that minor flood we can deal with, but breaching causes loss of life. And so we create these imaginary storms, if you will, or really, really unlikely storms to prove that our designs don't breach because it causes loss of life.
Irene asked, can you please describe in a little more detail what changes would be made to the auxiliary spillway of the West Wash Dam and alternative route? As I mentioned, the width of the auxiliary spillway has actually changed from its original construction. The side slopes have sloughed down, so now the channel bottom width is only 50 feet, whereas originally 80 feet. So what we would do is the side slopes would then be shored up to like a 2-to-1 slope. We would armor those side slopes with big boulders, riprap, to protect them from breaching in case they gets activated. And the bottom of that spillway would be widened to 80 feet, and we would lower the crest of it by 2.5 feet.
Was back to one of the earlier comments from one of the gentlemen earlier. Right now, as is, the spillway can't pass that PMP, and that's what causes such a problem. So we'll be making it larger so it can pass the PMP.
He said, thank you for your time in this presentation. FYI, I live in a flood zone, Hidden Valley, pay flood insurance. I appreciate your presentation. Thank you. Any questions?
I guess one of my questions is, once you elevate the earth dam, is it still going to be accessible to cross from one neighborhood to the other?
Steve.
Your question is, can people access the dam? Rest? Well, we don't want to promote it, but obviously everybody's using it, and it'd be the same situation. But again, we get our state reports and they say, minimize traffic, foot traffic. It's hard for people to believe that foot traffic does damage to the dams. But that's why I'm kind of a little hesitant on answering that question. It's like, oh yeah, go ahead, walk, all that, but it's going to be remaining the same. You said that.
Walk your dogs, wintertime sled, cross country ski. There's a lot of people that use it for a lot of different activities. Not to mention there's 2 coyotes that live out there permanently. Is that going to change any of that? Are we going to, in the process while you're working on the West Dam, is that going to limit our ability to go back there? I'm just wondering if you're going to kick us out, or we're going to have access to it, or, whether the change is going to be done during the process of redoing this whole project.
During construction and different part of phases of the project, there will be areas that will be shut down, closed to access. And that would be all coordinated during construction, just like as we would typical project where we go down Virginia Street, do construction, we close a block at a time and then open up access. But is that the question you're asking? Yeah, for safety though, we won't allow anybody near the equipment during construction. I don't know if the Zoom members or the Zoom meeting heard that, but it was during the water line project that was going through. It did shut it off, but they did still have access to get in that section of the dam.
We're here to work on the flood issue. This is not a project to change any of the public access there, but we wouldn't want people around. Bulldozers are running.
What mitigation would there be around preventing invasive species of plants coming in during the construction on construction equipment? There was some grading done for a proposed bike shop a few years ago by the alternative spillway off of the East Dam. And there was definitely an increase of invasive species in that area. I believe it came in on the construction equipment. What would be done to make sure that additional invasive species wouldn't be coming in?
So typically for public projects, mitigation measures for preventing the spread of invasive species is to require the contractor to wash down his equipment in a controlled area before mobilizing to the site. So when we go through the EA process and, your comment especially, these are things we'll think about, and we create essentially mitigation measures that we commit to during the construction process. So I see that being one of our mitigation measures that the contractor would have to follow, is wash down of equipment in a contained area before mobilizing to the site.
Second level to that is getting native veg established as soon as we can.
From the Zoom, one of the questions from Karen Vargas is, I'm assuming the dam will continue to be earthen. Is there any way to complete the project without raising the dam 5 feet? And is the 5 feet above the existing dam? So first of all, the 5 feet is above the existing dam crest, and it will continue to be an earthen dam. So we have done our absolute best to keep that dam raise as low as possible during our planning and modeling process. Indulge me for a minute. When the original report was done in 2006, the value that the PMP overtopped the dam by was 2 feet. And that was the working assumption going into this project. A simple 2-foot raise. When we did our new updated models based on different soil characterizations of the watershed, different rainfall characterizations due to climate change, the dam overtopped by 10 feet. So we knew we couldn't raise it 10 feet. So that's why we're doing the grading to improve the storage area, the impoundment storage of the dam. So we're limiting the dam raise to only 5 feet. During final design, we might be able to refine that a little bit, but right now 5 feet is kind of what we're looking at.
Just want to stress that this is a planning level study. Yeah, maybe when we get in and do the height design could be 4. I mean, that just saves the city money. So we'll definitely be looking.
Gene Johnson asked, will all the trees be removed from the existing watershed? So yeah, the current trees and vegetation that are underneath the dam right now, they will have to be removed for the grading process to improve the storage volume of the dam. However, like we've stated, the entire area will be revegetated at the end of the project so that the trees, scrub, everything can grow back to its original state.
So the intent, along that ditch that's there, all that well-established vegetation, there, our intent would to be to minimize any removal of that vegetation and start that grading right at the limits of that vegetation going westward. So that's the intent, is to salvage that riparian area and not disturb that. However, all the sagebrush and everything west of that would be removed.
I would like to add to that too, also that trees ideally don't belong in dams. And I know these trees should be maintained and cut when they're about knee high, take out. So some have grown, but typically, no, we don't. You know, if a flood event does come up and it deroots the trees and then they're floating, they become a different type of hazard. But yeah, that's the trees will probably with the grading come out anyways, but they should have never grown to the extent that they did. And there's a few, but not many. Thanks.
Glenn asks, with option 3, will the field still be accessible? And also, yes, will the vegetation still be present? I think Steve addressed the access issue in terms of during construction and afterwards. And yeah, vegetation, we will do re-veg, and we'll do everything we can to keep existing vegetation in place. Melanie said to hold the mic closer. Sorry, Melanie, that it cuts in and out. I blame Greg. He said having the vegetation within the detention-based limits, maintenance access for removing sediment and should be discouraged. That's generally correct. Like Steve said, if we have a big flood come through that area and trees get uprooted, it will clog spillway inlets. It will create more hazard as things go down.
And to add to that, I think we would create essentially maintenance roads to the structures that the city needs to access. In lieu of vegetating those areas. So there may be some, and we'll work strategically with the city of Reno to find out what makes sense from a maintenance standpoint and provide necessary access that wouldn't be revegetated so they can get that access to those structures.
I have 2 questions. One, will this involve any land trades, rezoning? Is that anticipated at all? I see a gentleman shaking his hand. That's good news. And number 2, as my neighbor mentioned behind me, this is, for lack of a better term, commons or parkland that the neighborhood enjoys. Is there an opportunity to improve it and make it a better experience for the people within the neighborhood?
Real quick, Steve, to tie in, one of the Zoom questions is along that same thought. Kevin asked, any thoughts to incorporating recreation into the finished project? NRCS will pay a percentage of project costs for public benefit recreation. This could be a great way to create an area that the public could use in a sustainable manner for passive recreation, such as non-motorized trails, rather than the current free-for-all that potentially affects slope/dam soil stability.
So the current grant is for dam safety criteria and performance standing. I believe that's the funding that NRCS is providing. We can look into other options, most likely not including a recreation site into this part of the project, but we coordinate that with our project so we know what's going on and we won't have any interference with the dams, but we'd have to look at the location. What I'm trying to say, I see you kind of giving me a half nod, is we could do something outside of the limits of the dam. I know some people say that inside the detention basin, they have parks and all that. You have a floating garbage can is what I think. You can't have that during a flood event, but you could also create an emergency action plan to remove that garbage can before the flood event comes. There's ways of doing it, but for the grant part of the project, money would have to come elsewhere. It wouldn't come from this grant. Because it's safety and performance standards, what we're trying to update here.
LH asked, where will the heavy equipment be stored when not in use?
So we would work with the contractor to establish a staging area when the equipment's not in use, for the evenings, weekends. And my thought right now is it would likely be within the basin area, with the exception when there's a large flood event coming, then they would prepare for that and move their equipment out. But, you know, there's really outside of that basin, it's so heavily developed as far as residential homes. There's really no good areas than other than within the basin itself. So my guess right now is, unless the city wants to chime in, is that equipment would be stored for the evenings and the weekends within the basin area. Thank you for that comment, and we'll definitely look at that when we get to that phase of the project.
LH also asked, would Reno Parks and Rec be involved in a recreation angle? Kind of what Steve was saying there. You know, we'll look at that. But the funding won't come from NRCS, correct?
And also to add to that, we have been talking with parks. There was discussion at our last public meeting of, I believe it was called the Keystone Canyon Van Ness Recreation Site. At that meeting, we said it was on the corner where the East Wash Dam presently was, but it's actually the parcel right below it. And again, that's within the limits of the property, but it potentially might be out of our doing any interference with the dam safety and standards. So that was the area that I think they were talking last time, and we have been talking with them, and it's I've been trying to find conceptual drawings. I haven't found any yet, but it's basically conceptual ideas right now is what I'm hearing of parks. So we have been talking with them, trying to figure what that recreation area actually is that many know about from parks. The other questions? Yeah, one come up.
LH said, I have an old conceptual drawing from 2008 for a trailhead concept there.
So the actual trailhead or the recreation site, but I would like to get in touch with that person. And Reno Parks is looking for these drawings for me as well. Other questions?
Want to thank everybody for coming this evening. We appreciate your attendance on Zoom and here. We will stay here in the room for a little while longer to answer to any of the questions for the public that's here. So if you have any questions, feel free to come up and ask. A few maps around the room here to point at if you have any questions. But we do appreciate your time this evening and thank you for attending.
Add one more slide in, and my contact information is on our website. It's reno.gov/West Wash Dam Rehabilitation Project. And at that bottom of that screen is my contact information where you could email me directly. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.